Some empires built monuments to prove their greatness, but behind those walls they destroyed women in ways that made death look merciful. A woman in history could be crowned as a queen, wrapped in jewels, or locked away in chains. For centuries, empires rose with promises of glory, yet behind palace walls and in dusty courtyards, women often carried the heaviest price. Their bodies became tools of politics, their voices buried under silence, and their fates sealed by rulers who saw them not as human beings, but as possessions. The cruelty that some women endured in these empires was not just suffering, it was torment. Torment that lingered long after breath itself would have been kinder. Imagine for a moment a young girl, barely in her teens, chosen not for her heart or her will, but for her womb. Dragged into rituals disguised as marriages, her life was decided before she had spoken a word. These stories, preserved in chronicles, fragments of law codes, and whispers that trickled through centuries, paint a horrifying picture of how power twisted femininity into a curse. These were not isolated tragedies, but systems, vast empires where cruelty was normalized and where the torment of women became part of imperial order. The first of these empires takes us back to the dust and fire of the ancient world, the Assyrian Empire. To stand in Nineveh or Ashur was to stand in a kingdom that prided itself on conquest, monuments carved in stone, and rulers who demanded obedience like gods. But beneath the sculptures of winged lions and inscriptions boasting of victory, there existed a shadowed code, one that placed women at the mercy of men's whims. The Assyrians carved their laws into stone, eternal and merciless. Their legal code declared that a woman's honor did not belong to her. It belonged to her father, her husband, or her master. To defy this chain was to invite punishment beyond imagination. Take the case of veiling. In Assyria, respectable married women were required by law to wear veils in public, as if their faces were private property not meant for the eyes of common men. Yet the same code commanded that prostitutes, slaves, and concubines were forbidden to veil themselves. If one of them dared to cover her face, she could be stripped, whipped, and mutilated in public. Respectability was not earned by dignity, but by ownership. And when a woman was accused of adultery, her fate lay entirely in the hands of her husband. If he wished, he could kill her without trial. If he wished, he could mutilate her and send her back to her father in disgrace. And if he wished, he could pardon her. But only because forgiveness was his right, not hers. The very word justice in Assyria bent itself to the will of men, while women bore the consequences. Worse still were the punishments for defiance. An Assyrian law tablet describes how a woman who insulted a man of higher status could have her ears torn off, her nose cut away, her face disfigured so that she would carry shame forever. These were not whispered cruelties, but written laws, proudly displayed as proof of the empire's order. Death might have been a mercy compared to such lifelong scars. But perhaps most chilling was the way Assyria treated women's bodies in war. Conquest was not only about land, it was about domination. In relief carvings that still exist today, Assyrian kings are shown parading captives, their families broken, their women dragged in chains. The empire turned the humiliation of women into a theater of power, a message carved in stone for all enemies. Resist, and your daughters will be trophies. What makes this cruelty unbearable is not only the pain but the system that justified it. A woman in Assyria lived not for herself but for the empire's hierarchy. Her worth was calculated by bloodlines, her survival dictated by obedience, and when she faltered, or even when she was merely suspected, the punishment was designed not to kill, but to make her wish she had died. This is just the beginning. As we leave the shadow of Assyria, the story grows darker still. For cruelty toward women did not end with one empire. It found new forms, new justifications, and new stages on which to unfold. And in the next empire, it would be cloaked in splendor, dressed in silks and jewels, but beneath the glitter lay torment as suffocating as any chain. An empire may dress its women in silk and gold, but behind the curtains of luxury, some were prisoners in cages more suffocating than iron chains. If Assyria's cruelty was carved in stone, Rome's was written in spectacle. The Roman Empire is remembered for its grand arenas, marble statues, and the myth of civilization. Yet for women inside its borders, life often balanced on the edge of humiliation and survival. Rome loved order, but its order was built on the subjugation of bodies, and women's bodies were perhaps the most exploited of all. A Roman woman's worth was tied to the men around her. A daughter belonged to her father, a wife belonged to her husband, and even a widow's fate could be seized by the state. The Latin word paterfamilias, the absolute authority of the male head of the household, meant that a man could command life or death within his family. His daughter could be married off as a bargaining chip, his wife could be cast aside with a few words, and if he suspected infidelity, he could kill her, often without facing punishment. But Rome's cruelty toward women was not confined to its laws. It bled into its culture of entertainment. The empire fed on spectacle, and women sometimes became unwilling players in its brutal theatre. Ancient texts whisper of noble women condemned to the arena, stripped of dignity before crowds who cheered their suffering. For the sake of entertainment, a woman's body could be thrown to wild beasts or forced into mock battles where survival was nearly impossible. To die in silence was expected, for Rome admired endurance, even in agony. Yet behind the polished image of patrician wives and marble matrons, another world existed, the world of slavery and concubinage. Thousands of women were dragged into Rome as spoils of war. They came from conquered provinces, Gaul, Greece, Egypt, Judea. To the empire they were not humor, ends but property, their futures reduced to transactions. Sold in markets, they became the invisible workforce of Roman households and the hidden pleasures of their masters. A slave woman could be used, discarded, or traded, and her children would inherit her chains. And even those who rose to the rank of empress were not safe. The palace, gleaming with marble floors and golden ceilings, was no refuge from fear. Empresses like Messalina and Julia Domna discovered that in Rome, power was a fragile illusion for women. Their every move was scrutinized, every rumor twisted into scandal. A whisper of betrayal could mean forced suicide, exile, or worse. For the wives of emperors, the crown glittered like a blade, beautiful, but ready to cut. Rome prided itself on law, yet its laws treated women as shadows. A woman could not vote, could not hold office, and her testimony in court was often dismissed. She lived in a world where her silence was not just expected, but enforced. And when she broke that silence, Rome reminded her brutally of her place. Still, perhaps the most haunting aspect was the contradiction. Rome celebrated goddesses like Venus and Juno, carving their beauty into statues that still inspire awe today. Yet the real women of Rome lived under chains both visible and invisible. Worshipped in myth, silenced in reality, decorated in poetry, destroyed in life. For all its marble and glory, Rome was an empire that taught women one cruel lesson. Survival was not guaranteed, and dignity was rarely permitted. Death in the arena might have been swift, but the slow death of being owned, silenced, and discarded, that was the fate most endured. But history does not stop with Rome. Another empire would rise centuries later, cloaked not in togas and laurel wreaths, but in the silks and jewels of Eastern courts. Here, women would be locked away in golden cages, where every breath, every glance, and every step was controlled. Their world was not carved in stone or shouted in arenas, but whispered behind veils and closed palace doors. And their suffering, hidden from public view, became a secret torment that was, in its own way, worse than death. The story of cruelty toward women did not end with Rome. As centuries passed and new empires rose, the suffering only changed its shape. Where Rome had chained women in law and spectacle, another empire built prisons disguised as palaces. These were not cages of iron, but of gold, silk, and marble. The women here were not paraded before crowds. They were hidden behind walls so high that the world forgot their names, their voices, and sometimes even their existence. This was the reality of the great Eastern harems, where the most delicate ornaments of the empire lived under conditions that turned their lives into a silent nightmare. To be chosen for the harem was, on the surface, considered an honor. Families believed their daughters were entering a world of luxury. Endless fabrics, golden lamps, perfumes, and fine jewels. From the outside, it looked like paradise, but inside, it was a prison so suffocating that many women prayed for freedom, even if it came in the form of death. These women belonged not to themselves, but to the emperor alone. Their every movement, every word, even their gaze was watched and measured. The walls of the harem were not just physical. They were psychological chains that silenced individuality and turned women into faceless possessions. Life inside the harem was a constant struggle for survival. Hundreds of women lived together, each one vying for the emperor's attention. To be ignored was to be forgotten, and to be forgotten was to disappear into the shadows of the palace, condemned to a life of loneliness. But to be favored was equally dangerous, for it invited jealousy, rivalry, and betrayal. Poison slipped into drinks, silks laced with deadly powders, whispered rumors that destroyed reputations. These were the weapons of women trapped in an endless game of survival. A smile could be fatal, a glance could trigger suspicion, and a single word could decide who lived in comfort and who died in despair. The cruelty was not always visible. It was in the rules that governed every step of their lives. A woman could not leave, could not see her family, could not speak to men outside the palace. Letters, if written, were inspected and censored. Dreams of escape were impossible, for the harem was guarded by eunuchs whose loyalty was to the emperor alone. For many, the walls of the harem became their tomb. They entered as young girls and died within those walls, their names erased from memory, their stories buried in silence. But the deepest suffering came not from rivalry or isolation, but from the way their bodies were treated as tools of politics. Women in the harem were pawns in games of power. A son born from a favored concubine could rise to be the next emperor, shifting the entire balance of the empire. This gave certain women immense influence, but it also put them at constant risk. To be the mother of a powerful heir was both a crown and a curse. History tells of countless women whose children were murdered in their cradles to eliminate rivals. Mothers who were forced to watch their sons strangled with silken cords, powerless to save them. The harem was not just a palace of beauty, it was a graveyard of broken mothers, carrying grief that had no name. Even those who rose to power within the harem were never free. Some became legendary figures, women who advised emperors, plotted in politics, and ruled from the shadows. Yet even their victories came at a cost. They lived every day surrounded by enemies, knowing that the same power which lifted them could destroy them in an instant. Their thrones were built on fragile foundations, and one misstep could erase them from history. What makes the story of the harem most terrifying is the silence that surrounds it. Unlike Rome's arenas or Assyria's stone laws, the pain of these women was hidden behind veils and locked doors. There were no witnesses to their suffering, no public records of their torment. Generations of women lived and died in these golden prisons, their stories swallowed by time. To the outside world, the empire appeared glittering and magnificent. But within, women endured a kind of suffering that was slow, suffocating and endless, a life sentence without crime. For these women, death was not the greatest fear. Their deepest fear was to be forgotten, to live unseen, unloved and erased. The empire that promised them honor and beauty instead gave them chains more binding than iron. And so history remembers them not for who they were, but for the silence forced upon them. This was the final empire where women endured torment worse than death. From Assyria's merciless laws to Rome's brutal spectacles, and finally to the golden prisons of the East, the story is the same. Behind every empire's glory, women bore a darkness that no monument could erase. Their pain echoes across centuries, a haunting reminder that power, when unchecked, turns human lives into shadows. Empires rise with gold, power, and conquest, but behind their marble walls and jeweled palaces lies another truth, one wrapped not in triumph, but in silent screams. If Rome wrote its cruelty in law and spectacle, the Ottoman Empire stitched its power into silk and locked its secrets behind gilded lattices. And within those golden cages, women lived a life that was not quite life at all. They were not peasants struggling for bread, nor noble wives enjoying estates. They were queens without crowns, prisoners in velvet cells. Their bodies were pampered, but their souls suffocated in silence. This was the empire of the harem, a place history disguised as luxury, but which many women experienced as a fate worse than death. Step inside Topkapi Palace, the beating heart of Ottoman majesty. From its outer courtyards, one saw soldiers in glittering armor, scholars debating under cypress trees, and fountains whispering streams of cool water. But beyond those walls, deeper inside the palace, stood the harem, the forbidden world where hundreds of women lived, hidden from the gaze of the outside. The very word harem meant forbidden, and to most of the empire's people it was a mystery. They imagined silk cushions, dancers with jewel-studded veils, and perfumes floating in the air. Yet for the women forced to live there, reality was far colder. The harem was a paradox. To the outside world, it was paradise. To those inside, it was a gilded cage. The women who lived there had no freedom to leave, no choice over their futures. Some were gifts sent by foreign rulers, tokens of loyalty wrapped in human flesh. Others were captured as slaves from the corners of empire, Greek girls, Circassian beauties, Slavic maidens, Armenian daughters, plucked from their homes, renamed and reshaped into faceless shadows of their former selves. Their hair was combed, their bodies bathed, their manner was drilled into perfection by older matrons who had once been captives themselves. They were trained like soldiers, but for a battlefield of silks and whispers, where survival depended not on swords, but on seduction and silence. Every woman in the harem lived under the gaze of the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, whose word was law within those walls. The Valide controlled every movement, every permission, every dream the women might dare to have. For many, even sunlight was rationed, allowed only in certain courtyards, for certain hours. Their voices could not echo outside the chambers. They were locked away not only from the city, but even from the very empire they were told they belonged to. What was their crime? To be beautiful, to be fertile, to be chosen by fate and stolen by power. Life inside the harem followed rules harsher than any battlefield. Girls as young as 12 were brought in, polished like jewels, and tested for their ability to dance, sing, or recite poetry. They learned languages, etiquette, and charms because their future depended on catching the eye of a single man, the Sultan. To fail was to fade into obscurity, perhaps given as a wife to some lesser official, or worse, to serve the rest of their lives as attendants, nameless and forgotten. To succeed was no less dangerous, for if the Sultan favored you, jealousy followed like a shadow. Every woman who rose attracted rivals, and rivals plotted with daggers sharper than steel, rumors, poisons, and betrayal. This was not just a household of women, it was a battlefield of ambition. Imagine being one of them. Imagine being dragged from your village, your mother screaming as soldiers pulled you away, your name stripped the moment you entered the palace gates. You became not who you were, but who they wanted you to be. A new name, a new identity, a doll clothed in silks, lips painted, eyes trained to look down. Imagine nights when laughter echoed in the marble halls. But in your chamber, you cried into the velvet cushions, your tears soaking into fabric that smelled of musk and incense. No letter could reach your family, no news of home could reach your ears. You were alive, yet erased from the world that once knew you. And for what? To wait. Wait for the Sultan's glance. Wait for a chance that might lift you from obscurity into favor. But favor came at a price. Once chosen, you were expected to give him sons. And if you failed, if your womb betrayed you, your days of silk turned into days of silence. Some women never bore children. Some bore daughters and were cast aside. Others bore sons, and that is where the cruelest twist of all appeared. For in the Ottoman Empire, princes were rivals to one another, and to ensure no threat to the throne, it was tradition that when one prince became sultan, his brothers were strangled, sometimes as infants, sometimes as young men. Imagine being a mother in that palace, knowing that giving birth to a son was both your greatest triumph and the shadow of your greatest grief. You might kiss your child's head, knowing one day a bowstring could crush his throat. Women lived not just with their own captivity, but with the certainty that their sons might die because of the empire they had been forced into. Death was not always quick nor merciful. Poisoned sherbets, daggers hidden in cushions, silk cords pulled tight in the night. The harem silenced its own with methods as graceful as they were brutal, and outside, the world never knew. To the empire, the sultan's harem was a place of beauty and music. To the women trapped within, it was a labyrinth of suspicion where every smile might hide a knife. But there is another cruelty more chilling than death: forgetting. The women of the harem rarely left their names in history. They were mothers of sultans, lovers of emperors, yet their true voices were never recorded. They lived in marble rooms but left no legacy but the children they bore. Their faces vanished into shadows, their words dissolved into silence. For every famous Hurrem Sultan who wielded power beside her husband, there were 100 nameless women who died without anyone remembering they had ever lived. Their lives were not only controlled, but erased. Think of the slow suffocation of such existence. No battlefield, no public execution, no heroic martyrdom. Just the endless days of waiting, of playing music for a man who might never look at you, of carrying a child whose future was uncertain, of being forgotten while still alive. Death came not once, but every day, in every stolen name, every silenced thought, every child taken from your arms to be raised by strangers. And still, the empire thrived. Sultans ruled for centuries. Armies marched. Mosques rose with domes that touched the sky, and the women remained unseen. They were ghosts who breathed, shadows dressed in silk, queens without crowns. What made it worse than death was not only the suffering, but the contradiction. These women were clothed in jewels, but they could not own their lives. They lived in palaces, but they could not walk beyond their walls. They bore the empire's heirs, yet were treated as disposable. Luxury without freedom, beauty without voice, motherhood without peace. This was the fate of women in the Ottoman harem. And so, the empire marched on century after century, while the women remained faceless within its walls. Their laughter, their tears, their whispered prayers, all dissolved into the marble, into the silence of locked chambers where the air grew heavy with secrets. History recorded the names of sultans, generals, and viziers, but almost never those of the women who carried the blood of empires within their wombs. Their tragedy was not the dramatic death of warriors on a battlefield, nor the public executions that turned city squares into theatres of fear. Their tragedy was invisible, buried under velvet and silk. It was the death of self, the quiet erasure of identity, the slow suffocation of freedom, the endless waiting for a life that never came. For every mosque that glittered under the sun, for every empire that stretched across continents, there were women who had been broken, silenced, and forgotten. They were the ghosts of glory, the hidden sacrifices upon which empires built their pride. And though their names are lost, their suffering lingers like a shadow in history, reminding us that behind the beauty of power often lies a cruelty deeper than death itself. Because in these empires, a woman did not have to die to be buried. She lived her whole life as if already entombed, breathing yet erased, alive yet forgotten. That was their fate, that was their empire, that was the cruelty worse than death.